on field crops in Manitoba and focusing on what I call my top 10 list from 2012. And where we can, we're going to look at, should these insects be a problem next year? For some of them, we can make at least guesses. Others are very hard to predict. So where we can, we'll try to do a forecast for 2013 as well. I always like to start reminding people, though, that on any given field on your farm, on any given day over the summer, there will likely be a lot of insects there. Now, my presentation is going to focus on the ones that feed on the crop, but aside from those, there's a lot of insect activity in any given field. If a crop is in flower, you've always got lots of pollinators there, things like honeybees, bumblebees, syrphid flies, lots of different things. A lot of the insects, if you sweep a canola field or alfalfa field, you often get a lot of what look like tiny black wasps or tiny flies. A lot of times these are parasites. So there's a lot of parasites, predators, things that eat other insects in the field, things like damsel bugs, ladybugs, pirate bugs. So they're a big component of the insect population. On the ground, there's often things that are eating seeds on the ground, so weed seeds, things like ground beetles, crickets, they can eat a lot of weed seeds. There are things that will be feeding on the stubble. There will be insects that feed on the funguses and bacteria that decompose the stubble. So bottom line, in any field on any given day, there's going to be a lot of insect activity. That may or may not be a bad thing. And again, the job of an agronomist or a farmer or crop scout is to assess what is the population like, and are the ones that do feed on the crop at levels where they potentially could be economical. Now, what makes a population economical or not depends on several things, one of them being weather. Last year we had a mild winter, and it probably did allow a few things that normally wouldn't survive well here to get through the winter, at least in low levels. Another thing that affected the insect situation last year was the early seeding. We had a very early spring. People were seeding into ground that was relatively cool, and the crop was sitting at a young, quite vulnerable stage for a long period. So that will affect which insects will be potential problems and the risk of them. We also had some very early winds from the south last year. And there's a lot of insects in Manitoba that unless we get them blowing in on the winds from the south early, they likely won't be a problem. So there's a few diamondback moths, armyworms, aster leafhoppers. There's a few that fit into that category. And we did get some early winds last year, which did affect things. We also had some dry conditions late in the season, and that will favor some insects and be a detriment to others. The first insect I'm going to cover is aster leafhoppers. This is an insect that can overwinter here, but usually does so very poorly. So for us to see a lot of them, they usually have to blow in on the wind. Now, aster leafhopper is the vector of the disease called aster yellows. After last year, most people probably know what aster yellows is. Especially if you were growing canola, you would have seen the symptoms. Aster yellows was a problem last year because we had a very big leafhopper population, aster leafhopper population, blow in relatively early, and they were highly infected with the disease that causes aster yellows. So here's a canola plant, and I'm sure you saw some of this last year. Pods, instead of being nice and long, were more club-shaped, and they would have a bit of a purplish tinge to them. And if you were to try to open a few of these, you would notice that a lot of them are sterile pods. That's one of the symptoms of aster yellows in canola. In canola, aster yellows is very visible, and when a field has it, usually you can see it quite well because of the odd-shaped pods. And also when the canola gets to be a more mature crop and the crop starts to naturally lean a little bit, those aster yellow infected stems just stand straight up. So the aster yellows becomes very highly visible, and sometimes is easy to overestimate because the damaged plants are so noticeable. A couple cautionary notes about leafhoppers before we talk more about aster leafhopper. We've actually got a lot of different species of leafhoppers in Manitoba. In fact, there's over 350 species of leafhoppers in Manitoba and over 1,200 in Canada. And it's really just aster leafhopper that can transmit the aster yellows. There are a couple other leafhoppers that are considered minor vectors of aster yellows. But on their own, they would never result in significant aster yellows problems. For us to have a bad aster yellows year, you need a high population of aster leafhopper. The other 350 or so species that are out there are non-vectors. They can't spread the disease. And I always like to mention that because in any given year, if you're scouting your roadside ditches, your field edges early in the season, often there are a lot of leafhoppers in those places, but not the ones that spread aster yellows, especially the roadside ditches. If you're kicking around looking for grasshoppers and things early on, there's often a lot of leafhoppers there, but again, they're not the species that spread the aster yellows. So don't be alarmed if you do start seeing leafhoppers in, say, May or June in the roadside ditches. It may or it may not be aster leafhopper. That's the first thing you have to figure out. Is it the species that spreads aster yellows? So I'll skip ahead to how to identify aster leafhoppers. Now, aster leafhoppers are a very small leafhopper, and they also are called thick-spotted leafhopper. When a sample comes into me, what I'm looking for to verify that it potentially is aster leafhopper, I look on the head, and you can see on the head of this leafhopper at the very end of what look like, well, there's the eyes at either end, and you can see black eye spots. But in between those two black eye spots, there's two other black dots. And in front of those two black dots, there are what look like 4 black dashes. That's why they call aster leafhopper the six-spotted leafhopper. That's another name for it. It's got the 2 spots and the 4 dashes, so 6 spots. That's what I'm looking for, just to verify that they are aster leafhoppers. Now, for a situation where they come into me, I've got a microscope I can put them under. I can have a really close look. And sometimes with a good magnifying glass, you can see that. In the field, you won't be able to see that. Even if you catch a few in a sweep net, it can be hard to see without a bit of magnification. So you may have to bring them into an ag office, or if you have a good magnifier, you could have a look for that. If you're worried about it, if you do see some leafhoppers and you're worried that they could be aster leafhoppers, send in a sample, and we would be able to tell you fairly quickly if they are or not. But again, in most years, what you're finding early on is some of these other species that are out there. I mentioned aster leafhopper being a small insect, so you can see on this slide here, the leafhopper on the penny, it's barely as big as the one on the 1-cent coin. So quite small leafhoppers, and again, you'll have trouble seeing those spots without some magnification. Now, the reason aster leafhopper is a problem isn't because of the sap they feed on, it's the saliva that they inject into the plants. When aster leafhopper or any leafhopper feeds on the plants, what they do is they pierce the tissue of the plant with their beak, and before they feed, they inject some saliva, which basically breaks down the cells and liquefies an area where they can then suck up the sap. It's that saliva injection that is the real problem. If the leafhoppers are infected with the disease that causes aster yellows, it's that saliva injection that will spread the disease to your plants. And that can happen within literally minutes of a leafhopper population arriving in a field. So if you've had a population blow in, probably by the next day or the next couple of days, the leafhoppers that are there and are infected will have already spread the disease. So disease transmission happens very quickly. Now, you don't see the symptoms for a couple weeks after they've been transmitted, but the transmission of the disease itself will happen quite quickly. Aspergillus isn't just the disease of canola either. That's where it gets the most attention. It does infect a lot of different plants. Cereal crops, sunflowers, flax, a lot of vegetable crops, a lot of wild plants, things in the aster family, your wild asters and things like that will carry the disease and be infected. In cereal crops, it often gets misdiagnosed. People often will call it barley yellow dwarf or write it off as other diseases. So it gets probably misdiagnosed and underestimated in cereal crops, and if anything, maybe a little bit overestimated in canola crops because it is so visible. And just as another side note, canola is not the preferred host for aster leafhoppers. They actually don't like canola a lot. If they land in a canola field, they will feed on it. But in studies done in the past, what we've noticed is it's hard to find juvenile leafhoppers, juvenile aster leafhoppers in canola. When they land in a canola field, they'll feed for a while, but then they move to a more preferred crop, such as wheat or barley or one of the cereal crops, or one of their other more preferred hosts. And that's where they'll reproduce and start going through their other generations. So canola is not a preferred crop, but it's something they will feed on, and it's something where the symptoms are highly visible. Here's a picture of a carrot crop that's showing purple top. In a lot of horticulture crops, aspergillus is a major problem. And once the leafhoppers arrive in big numbers and they're known to be carrying the phytoplasm that causes the disease, carrot growers often go on weekly or 10-day spray programs to try to contain the aspergillus. They are not 100% successful. They will still get some aspergillus in their crop, but it will be reduced. And for them, it's economical to be doing these regular spray programs to try to manage aspergillus. In field crops, things are a bit different. A one-time spray is very hit and miss whether it will do anything at all. I've heard people suggest that they know of situations where a flea beetle spray appeared to have probably helped reduce aspergillus in one of their fields, but then I'll hear another farmer say, yes, but I sprayed my canola at the same time, and I had lots of aspergillus. It's a hit and miss situation trying to target a field crop with a single spray and try to control aspergillus. Very hit and miss whether it's going to work at all. Multiple sprays probably would, but they're just not going to be economical in field crops. So in a crop like canola or cereals, it's a very tricky situation when the aster leafhoppers do arrive. Here's a shot of a carrot root with a lot of hairs on it. When carrots get aspergillus, they taste very bitter. So if you had any carrots in your garden or on your farm last year, and a few tasted very bitter and had very hairy roots, that could have been from aspergillus. One of the outbreaks that we've seen here in Manitoba, I'll back up here. Aspergillus is not a regular problem in Manitoba. We've had 3 outbreaks in the last 12 years, or 3 bad years in the last 12. Normally, it's something that would happen more once in 10 or once in 15 years. Historically, we just haven't had regular or multiple outbreaks year after year after year. Usually you get a bad year, then quite a few years between bad years. Although we have had 3 what I would consider bad years in the last 12, 2000, 2007, and 2012 were all bad years. Now after the 2000, I'll call it an outbreak, higher levels of aspergillus. There was a study done for 3 years looking at leafhopper populations and trying to correlate them with aspergillus. And in the next 3 years after that outbreak, in fact the next 6 years after it, they had very low levels of aspergillus. Although in 2 of the years they did have very high aster leafhopper populations. In 2001, a very high leafhopper population blew in, and that's the dotted line on this graph here. But the big population didn't blow in until August, so wasn't a bad aster yellows year. In 2003, which is represented by the solid line here, a very large population of aster leafhoppers blew in early in the season. So it was early June, a big population of aster leafhoppers blew in, but it wasn't a bad aster yellows year. And what happened in that year, the aster leafhoppers that did blow in weren't highly infected with the disease. So even though they blew in early and there was a big population, it wasn't a bad aster yellows year. So you need all three conditions to be present. You need aster leafhoppers blowing in early in big numbers, and they have to be highly infected with the disease. That's what happened last year. Whether it's going to happen again next year is really hard to predict. We have not historically had two bad years in a row. It's not to say it can't happen, but it hasn't happened in the past. What we're going to have to keep an eye on is the aster leafhopper populations in the south, and whether or not big populations are moving our way, and hopefully we'll get some data on how infected those leafhoppers are. Okay, I'm going to move on to cutworms. There was a lot of cutworm activity last year in Manitoba. Localized areas seemed to get hit hard. It wasn't widespread across the province, but there was a lot of localized damage in some areas. And when I use the term cutworms, I'm actually referring to a complex of species. They don't all feed the same way. Last year, the two most damaging species were dingy cutworm and redbacked. And the difference between them is on the left in your screen, this is dingy cutworm. They've got what I call tire tracks, or tire track-like pattern that runs down the back of the body. Dingy cutworm overwinters as a larva, is present very early in the season. As soon as the crop starts emerging, they're already there as larvae that overwintered. So they're feeding early. Dingy cutworm does not do a lot of clipping. What they will do is climb the plants and take chunks out of the leaves. Sometimes they eat them right to the ground, but they don't do a lot of your typical cutworm clipping. So if you're seeing a situation where you've got lots of defoliation happening in a field, but you're not seeing any insects that might explain it, do a bit of digging around the damaged plants. If it is dingy cutworm, sometimes it can be harder to diagnose. Redback cutworm, which is on the right in your screen, that's one of the species that we do consider a clipper. When they get to be larger larvae, they will essentially cut stems at ground level, and it looks like somebody came in with scissors and was cutting stems. So if you start seeing a lot of plants lying on the soil surface, good chance it could be something like redback cutworm or dark-sided cutworm, or one of the species that we do see doing more clipping. When you're scouting for cutworms, if you have a lot of young cutworms, the crop is still in the seedling stage, controlling cutworms when they're young is going to be your most cost-effective solution because you're preventing a lot of potential future damage. Once the cutworms get to be fully grown, once they're about an inch, inch and a half long, and particularly if you're starting to dig up these pupa cases, these are cutworm pupa cases, once they're fully grown caterpillars and starting to pupate, the damage for the season has been done. So at that point, any spraying would just be revenge spraying. So if you're at or above an economic threshold for cutworms, if you know you're above the threshold, spraying early is your best solution. As well, time you sprays as late in the day as practical. Cutworms are nocturnal. They rest in the soil during the day and come out at night to do their feeding. So late in the day is a better option. We are doing a study on parasites of cutworms here in Manitoba. Barb Sharonowski at the University of Manitoba is coordinating this. So what we're asking is if you have any fields that have lots of cutworms, contact myself or a farm production advisor, and we will fill you in on how to get those cutworms into this study. Possibly somebody will come to your field and do some collecting, or we could tell you how to send samples in to have them included in the study if you wish to do that. Another insect I wanted to cover at least briefly is armyworm. And the armyworm I'm talking about here isn't Bertha armyworm. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. This armyworm is one that doesn't overwinter here. It blows in from the south as an adult moth. And the larvae of this armyworm prefer to feed on cereal crops. Some people will call it the cereal armyworm. Things like wheat, oats, barley are preferred hosts. They will feed on timothy as well, and some forage grasses. They will feed on broadleaf plants such as canola and flax, but that's not their preferred host. They much prefer the cereal crops. In crops such as wheat, barley, what they will do initially is, as larvae, feed on the lower leaves. And so what you would see initially is a lot of chewing on some of those lower leaves. Later on, they will move up higher in the canopy and feed. They will potentially clip heads if a field is very heavily defoliated, but usually they will stick to leaf feeding until there's very heavy defoliation, with the one exception being a timothy crop. If you're growing timothy, they will climb up and feed on the heads very directly, even while there's still a lot of green leaf material. So in timothy, there's something you have to watch very carefully. Again, it's hard to predict what we can expect for this year because they do blow in as adult moths. This slide here shows what the adult moth looks like. They're a brown moth with a couple white dots on their wings, and we can trap for these and monitor them early in the season to know if they've blown in. If they arrive here as adults, usually you've got a few weeks before you will start seeing the larvae feeding on the plants. And the larvae in this case are nocturnal as well. They come up on the plants and feed in the day and hide underneath trash on the soil surface in the evening. So once again, if you have an economical population and you need to control them, spraying as late in the day as possible is certainly preferred. Okay, flea beetles on canola. Last year was a bit of a tricky one for us because I know a lot of people had problems with flea beetles, and there was a lot of foliar spraying going on. I would rate the population last year as probably moderate. I certainly have seen higher populations. But I think last year what happened, people were seeding earlier than normal in a lot of areas. And with the seed treatments that we use on the canola, they are effective against flea beetles. Almost all the canola seed will have Helix or Prosper or Acceleron, and that will give you about 3 weeks, maybe a little over 3 weeks in some cases, of protection from flea beetle feeding. But keep in mind, that's from the time of seeding, not from the time you see the plants above ground, from the time of seeding. So if you seed it in say, mid to late April, by mid-May, you could be in a situation where the seed treatment's starting to wear thin already. If the crop is still a seedling and the seed treatment is wearing thin, there certainly is a risk that you could get substantial or economic damage before the crop gets to that 3 to 4 leaf stage where it can compensate for the feeding easier. So last year there was a lot of foliar spraying and even some reseeding because essentially the seed treatments were wearing out and the plants were still in that early seedling stages. Any year when you seed your crop and it's taking a long time to get going, you may need to be doing additional scouting for flea beetles and potentially controlling adults with a foliar spray, even though you had a seed treatment on earlier in the season. So just something to keep an eye on. If the crop is struggling to get going, keep an eye out for flea beetles. Diamondback moth. We had an interesting situation last year where I put some traps up very early in the season because we had a very warm March and April. And I was actually getting diamondback moth in my traps in late March, which has never happened before. And some of them were in good shape as well, which to me is kind of anecdotal evidence that we may have had at least a small overwintering population in Manitoba last year. But we did have a big population blow in early in the season, and the population started to build to the point where, at least in the western part of the province, people were starting to get worried about the levels. But by late June, the population had collapsed on us. Often that doesn't happen. Often the population will just keep building and get higher and higher as they go through their generations over the season. For the last 2 years, our diamondback moth populations have essentially collapsed on us after they got an early start. What was happening the last couple of years is parasites were essentially taking the population to levels that were pretty much a fraction of the size they were earlier in the season. In particular, there's a parasite called Cotesia that we've been seeing a lot of over the past couple of years. In 2011, when we had a very heavy population in June and going into July for diamondback moth, we collected 200 larvae from about 4 fields in central Manitoba, and in 3 of the 4 fields, over 80% of the larvae had this parasite Cotesia inside them. So in some years, you will see that population build and then collapse. That's what happened last year. We can't predict well what to expect for diamondback moth this year, because what we get will depend on what blows in, when it blows in, and once again, what the parasite levels are going to be like. Will they contain it, or will the diamondback moth be able to go through its cycle and keep increasing its populations? A Bertha armyworm, there were, I would say, localized, scattered areas that had economic levels last year. We put up these green uni traps every year to monitor the adult moths, and we put out regional forecasts. These traps are not good at telling you what's going to happen in an individual field. In fact, the data can be misleading that way. Often the traps will show a high count of adults in them, but you won't get a lot of larvae in that particular field. You may or may not. What attracts the adult females to a field to lay eggs is the stage of the crop when they're ready to lay eggs. They highly prefer a field that is flowering over one that isn't. The traps that we put up attract only males. So again, there's very poor correlation between the trap counts and individual field infestations. But if we do get several high counts in a region, then we can at least suspect that that region may be at a higher risk. So that's how these traps work. And the traps did tell us that particularly the western part of the province, there may be some areas of higher risk, and that turned out to be the case. I know there was some spraying in western Manitoba last year. Not widespread, but at least some localized spraying. One of the things we did notice late in the season was some larvae that were diseased, which is a good indication that there is some natural controls out there working to contain the larvae. Quick note here, if you're scouting for Bertha armyworm, do note that they can be either green, brown, or black. These 3 Bertha armyworm here, they're all essentially the same stage of caterpillar, just different color forms. So they can be one of these 3 color forms, all the same species. So just take note of that if you're doing scouting for the larvae. And as mentioned, natural enemies are one of the big control factors. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I've got a few more slides to get through. We did see a lot of dead caterpillars clinging to the tops of plants last year in some areas. If you see dead Bertha armyworm at the top of the canopy during the day, you've either got a fungus or a virus in the population. If the caterpillars look like they're kind of melting into the plant, that's the virus. If the caterpillars kind of look like they're a chalky, almost a light brown to white color, they've got a fungus, and they're highly infected, so it's good to be seeing lots of those. So I'm going to move through these. Just to mention zebra caterpillar, this is another caterpillar that the last 2 years was more numerous than we normally see it. Normally it's not a pest of canola or any crop. They feed on a wide variety of things. Usually most of their feeding is on a lot of natural plants and not so much our field crops. You will at times find patches in a canola field that have high levels of zebra caterpillar. They can be very patchy, where you come across a patch that has lots, and the canola plants in that patch will be heavily defoliated. Usually, in most cases, if you do more thorough scouting of the entire field, you'll notice it's just a few patches that seem to be infected with them. So my caution is, if you come across a heavy patch of zebra caterpillar while you're out scouting, do a thorough field check. There are exceptions. I have heard of cases where some fields were, I guess, more uniformly infected with them. But in most cases, they are quite patchy. And they're another thing that can be controlled very well with natural enemies. A study in British Columbia a while back, they collected zebra caterpillars off of blueberries, and they found that over 50% of them were parasitized by a wasp called Microplitis. So natural enemies, particularly some of our parasites, are what normally keep these populations in check. Lygus bugs, I'm only going to mention these briefly. They will feed on canola. They will feed on buds, flowers, pods. In most years, if you have good soil moisture, the feeding to the buds and flowers is not economical. Canola will compensate well for missing buds and flowers. If Lygus removes 6 buds from a plant, you don't have 6 less pods. You may have maybe 1 or 2 less pods, depending on the conditions. In fact, a study in Winnipeg a few years back found that low levels of Lygus bug can actually increase yield when they're feeding on buds and flowers because the plants can overcompensate for the feeding. What canola can't compensate for is feeding to seeds. If they're feeding in the early podding stage, the plants can't compensate for that feeding. So that's really the critical staging for assessing your Lygus populations. That late flowering, early podding stage is those early pods that you have to protect. So I do encourage you to use a sweep net, sweep for Lygus bugs. If you're above the economic threshold, it's the early podding stage where you need to be concerned about protecting yield. So maybe I'll move on. Alfalfa weevil, I should mention this one at least briefly. A lot of the forage growers last year noticed the first cut was heavily defoliated. The insect doing that was alfalfa weevil. They're a green larva with a white stripe down the back. They're essentially a first cut problem. So for forage growers, it's something you want to be scouting for. Now, if you do notice you have a heavy population of them, you've got 2 options. There are sprays that are available that will control the larva. If most of the population is green, the green larva, and they're still quite young, an early cut will provide really good control. And as a general guideline, once the alfalfa is about 40 centimeters or more in height, if you were to cut that alfalfa, the caterpillars, the larvae, of alfalfa weevil, they can't move. They don't have legs, so they can't move very far. So if you cut the alfalfa and you get a few days of hot, warm weather, they essentially either desiccate or starve to death. So that can be a very effective control method, just doing an early cut and killing the larva that way. But do keep an eye on the regrowth. There are occasions where they will be feeding on that second cut regrowth. So keep an eye on that. After that, they usually are done for the season. Grasshoppers, populations weren't extremely heavy last year. In fact, here's our forecast map. Green on the map means our counts last August were relatively light. Yellow means counts were getting into that moderate range. So there's a few areas near Dauphin where we had a few higher counts. My one word of caution when you're trying to anticipate grasshoppers for next year, we did have very good egg-laying conditions. So even if you are in one of these green areas on the map, we had good egg-laying conditions. So it is possible we could have a fair number of eggs in the soil. If we get 1 or 2 more really hot, dry years, we could start seeing our grasshopper population build back. So the map this year could be a little deceiving because the map doesn't account for what the weather conditions were like during egg laying. Aphids, quick note, a lot of our damaging species do have to blow in. And last year, soybean aphid arrived very late, wasn't an issue. In cereals, the aphids arrived, while they started to build up in June, got to just below economic threshold levels, and then populations collapsed, mainly due to predators, parasites, and disease. So overall, last year wasn't a bad aphid year, but aphids are something that annually it's good to keep an eye on. And I'll wrap up by mentioning If you are caught in a situation where you are anticipating you need to spray a canola or alfalfa field or anything in flower, and you're at an economic threshold for something and you can't wait till the flowering is done, consider the pollinators in your field. A couple times last year I had farmers call me because agronomists were wondering if they should be tank mixing in an insecticide with their sclerotinia spray, almost as an insurance spray, because insecticide was cheap. My word of caution is if you've got something at an economic threshold that's going to do a lot, that might make sense. But one thing you have to keep in mind, canola will yield well on its own without pollinators. Canola yields better with pollinators. And there's been several studies on this, so you get different quotes on how much better is the yield with pollinators. The average, if you average out these studies, it comes out to somewhere around 10 to 15%, which is actually quite significant. That's a lot of money. It's probably more than your insecticide. So if you've got something worth spraying, it might make sense, but if you are spraying insecticide at flowering in canola for insurance purposes, you could be doing more harm than good by negating that pollinator effect. In fact, you could be decreasing your yields, not helping to increase them. So again, scouting's important. Know what's in the field. Spray for things that could be economical. But if there's nothing there, some high threat, don't be applying insecticides just because you're already spraying for sclerotinia and you want to toss something else in. So maybe I'll wrap it up with that, because I notice we're getting close to noon, and leave time for a question or two if we have any.
Does anybody have any questions for John? Did you hear the question, John? John, are you there?
Okay, I'm still hearing you.
Can you hear us, John?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, the question was, one of the growers had a high population of cutworms on his farm, and he didn't do any spraying on them. What are the chances of having a high population this year in the same spots?
Okay, the cutworm species that do the most damage here do overwinter in Manitoba, and it depends on the species how they're going to overwinter, whether it's eggs or larvae. One thing you have to keep in mind, though, when the cutworms are out laying their eggs, which is usually August and September, they're attracted to fields or areas of fields that have a little bit of food for the adult moths. So if you have a field nearby that is late flowering, maybe it's a later seeded canola field or a field of flax or alfalfa, that may draw them away from where they were in the present year, and so that the high patches aren't always the same year after year. Often it depends on, again, the habitat when the females are laying their eggs. And they're going to be drawn to fields and areas of fields with a little bit of flowering vegetation. Some of the species look for certain soil types to lay their eggs into. So those patches can move from year to year. They may not be in the same area. And just to give you an example, one year I went into a sunflower field, and there was a real big patch of cutworms. It was very patchy, and the farmer told me last year that was the big thistle patch. I think it was a cereal crop or something in the field, and there was a thistle patch. That's what would have drawn them to that particular area, was the flowering thistles late in the season. So again, those patches can move depending on what's there in August and September when they're laying their eggs.
Any other questions for John? Anybody? No, that's good. Okay, John, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, well, I don't think we have any more questions in the room. I want to thank you very much for joining us here today. I know it was a little bit of last-minute adjustment, but we certainly pulled it off, and we really appreciate